We'll move on to education budget. What's your pleasure, Council? Councilman Levy.
Your Honor, I make a motion to receive the committee report and approve the educational budget of $141,214,000 and $208,575 for health and welfare, for a total of $141,422,575.
Is that Councilman Cavo in second? Is there any discussion? Any discussion on the education budget? All right. Mr. Chianese, then Mr. Fox.
Okay. Again, we might as well just get it out of the way. So regarding the education budget, I know at the meeting there was a big discussion between the Board of Ed's budget and the state and the city's budget as far as the delta between what the deficit was, whether it's 8 million, 6 million. Can you just explain the current funding source that is currently in our budget and how that applies to the Board of Ed?
The Board of Ed, the request from the Board of Ed was about $15.5 million higher than the adopted budget last year, in the current year. That's about 11.3%. The City Council approved an increase, City Council approved an increase of 4.1 million. And there's also an additional 2.5 million approximately in alliance funding. As you know, that alliance funding, many years ago when the alliance funding started, we agreed that the alliance funding would go directly to the school and not come to us. So that's why we count that as part of that number. And plus, there's about 2.8, 2.9 of the surplus from fiscal year 21 that can be used. So that's a total of $9.3 million increase from the current year. Now, granted, the 2.8 is the intent of that is to use it for non-recurring or extraordinary items. That could be, for example, in maybe their insurances spike up. That would certainly qualify. Although that's not recurring, it's an extraordinary spike. Probably something that they would not, did not plan on that kind of increase. So that's what those funds would be used for. But in total, you know, that leaves about a gap of about $6.2 million.
Again, and now with the current state budget, the state is projecting an increase in the state funding of about $2,450,000 of additional funding that's above last year's ECS money. Has that money been currently accounted for in this budget or in the education budget?
It is. That's part of the alliance, the increase in alliance funding.
So it's in their budget, not our budget?
I'm not going to really talk to their budget because their budget had an incorrect beginning baseline. All I can tell you is that the difference between their proposed and their adopted from this year is about $15.5 million. We were able to account for $9.3 million. In that $9.3 million, part of that is the alliance, the increase in alliance.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you, Mr. St. Clair. Is there any further discussion on the education budget ad hoc? Councilman Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. St. Hilaire. David, I just want to piggyback on what Councilman Sinisi just said about the, I guess just call it a discrepancy in some of that financial data that we were getting. I never really seen such a divergence in those numbers and explanations before. I don't know what it was, the composition of the members of the Board of Ed, the new superintendent, the new finance director, maybe new sources of funding. I mean, I don't know what the reason was. But I guess the question is, of some of those funding, is most of it attached to a line item, or is it more of an agreement that we're going to provide this or you're going to get that? How does that whole thing work?
We give them a lump sum, and then they adjust their budget accordingly. And the only area where it gets a little more specific is in the recurring funds. We asked them to provide us some more explanation, on what they're requiring, or what they're asking for, so as not to create a financial cliff.
Okay. I know you can't answer it now, and it's probably too much of an explanation, but at some point in the near future, we've got to get together and figure out how to get this language at least more homogeneous for discussions, because it's,
Honestly, I think the difference was that they were in transition last year. I mean, as you all know, you could just look in our budget and you'll see what the number is. And I think there was confusion with the transition between not only the superintendent, but with the finance office. And so they were working from a baseline.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a general statement. We go through this a lot, this whole budget process, and we are in a spinning wheel. There are adjustments that need to be made to certain types of state-based formulas, education cost sharing. There needs to be adjustments to those types of formulas so that Danbury can get their fair share of tax dollars, because right now we're not getting it, okay? And we can't pin this whole burden of taxation on the backs of our community, because it'll break. So there needs to be some type of in-between that we can hope to achieve next budget cycle, at least. I didn't hear many individuals stand up during public speaking and mention anything about the mental health, mental wellness, social emotional needs of our students. Didn't hear much of that this time. We've been advocating for a while now, and I hope that some folks can just continue that conversation, because that's something that's well needed. I mean, with all this COVID stuff and all this lack of interaction between those vulnerable age groups, it starts to have an impact. We're starting to see it up at our place already. So let's just really have a better conversation about the social, emotional health. And, between all of those things, it makes it really, really difficult to, support what's going on with this budget. But thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Fox.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just want to speak a few words. I was a member of the Education Committee, and I've been exposed to this process for most of the last 16 years, pretty much from every possible angle. I was the Board of Ed chair advocating for the budget. I was a member of the PTO boards in between advocating and kind of having to deal with kind of volunteerism in place of funding for certain items. And then having sat on the council the past 7 years, looking at the concerns of the community, not just from the education side, but in terms of the general taxpayer side, in terms of how much in taxes can we afford. I'm someone who's had kids through the system from 02 to 2020. So I've seen it from that angle. But I'm also someone who's seen periods of unemployment, periods of no raises, periods of unexpected medical expenses, so on and so forth. So I've seen this from pretty much every angle. But I'd have to say, this year's process has been the most disappointing and the most frustrating of any of the past 16 years that I've seen from all of these different angles. Many, many questions were asked by the committee, including myself, and I won't rehash all of them, but I'll just pick one as an example in terms of what is the local percentage of education funding. And the Board of Education's presentation was significantly different than what the city had on that side. And that makes a big difference in terms of, what is our community's support of education? There's a per pupil funding statistic that many people use, but that doesn't take into account the $250 million that we've spent in building schools one after the other. I mean, we fill them faster than we can build them, but this community is investing huge sums of money from an operating budget and a capital budget into our educational system, which is doing an outstanding job. Having had 4 kids through the system, they could not have gotten a better education anywhere around here, just based on what I've seen, not just from my own kids, but from a lot of their peers in those years. But so many questions that we had this year, which is a critical year as our enrollment is growing and federal funding will decrease in future years just as COVID goes away. But there were so many questions that we just didn't get answered, and it's extremely disappointing. I think having this process culminate with a 2-hour meeting, and it was said by someone earlier in public speaking, just does not give the gravity of this process justice. I think this needs to be a continuous conversation over the course of the year so that when the board is making its budgetary formulation, they can look and see, well, what is the ability of the taxpayer to pay? And while state statute clearly defines who does what, it would be very helpful to have everyone in the room at the same time to talk about what we can do as a community, where else can we look, whether it's federal, state, et cetera. And then what is it that we don't get? And the one question that was not even asked or answered, which I think 12 years ago, we had a 0 increase. And I was, I think, on the Board of Ed at that time. But even at that time, it was not as frustrating because there was a list of items that were going to go away as a result of the budget that was not funded to the board's request. And so this year, we just don't have an idea. No one's presented to us. Here is the list of programs that go away if you don't fund the board's request. Those pieces of information would be very helpful for the councilman to see and for the public to see in terms of making, a final decision on the budget. So I just would like to see a lot more process improvement, especially as the next couple of years are going to be critical in terms of funding decisions for our city and for the state as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Under discussion for education budget, Councilman Santos.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to ask questions of the Finance Director for the Board of Education, if possible.
Board of Education?
Yep.
Yep.
He or Mr. Walston as superintendent. But, no, go ahead, sir. I'm going to ask a finance question, so I'll ask it from you. So we've heard from the city's finance director that perhaps there's an error or the budget that you've proposed is misguided. Can you explain that to us? Because we heard the same thing in the budget ad hoc, but I think the public and the folks who are voting here on this dais deserve an explanation of what is the difference.
Thank you for your question. My name's John Spang. It's my pleasure to meet some of you for the first time. Quite frankly, I don't think there's an error or a mistake. I think the numbers are quite clear, so I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, with all due respect.
Well, we just heard the finance director say that the numbers that you provided were erroneous, or they were, they weren't the correct numbers.
I think what he's referring to is the adoption of the 2021-22 operating budget by the Board of Education last June, I believe. That's where we found a difference between what the board thought they were getting from the council and what the council intended to give them. There were two items that are confusing. If you noticed, or if you heard in the resolution, the number for education was not $141 million. That's what the public schools are getting. Two other pieces. The piece called health and welfare. That's for non-public school nurses that we're required, that we provide and the city reimburses for. That's really not something that goes into the public schools. So I think there was confusion on that back in June. The second thing was money for the Head Start program. $214,000 the council has for many years given to the Head Start program. They give that the city gives that directly to the Head Start program. It's in the number you heard tonight, but that's not for public schools. And that was also considered part of the operating budget last June when it shouldn't have been. So as a result, Board of Ed adopted call it a city budget of $137,150,000. That's the starting number, when in fact it should have been $136,900,000 something. I believe if the finance director, I think, might agree, that's what we're talking about.
One more follow-up. What is the delta between what the proposed budget is tonight and your proposed budget? What are you not, the difference, what are you not getting?
11.4 million.
11.4 million. Okay, thank you. Just a general comment, Mr. Mayor. You know, we've heard some of the folks already make this comment over and over again. Every year we're here and we're discussing education once again. And as a taxpayer, a community member, a father and husband, it's disappointing every year to see that the Board of Education doesn't get what it needs. It's not wants, it's needs. I've been to the schools, and if you've heard me say this again, you're going to get tired of hearing it because I'm going to say it over and over again. I've been in the schools. I've seen classrooms on stages, in closets, at the end of hallways, behind sheets. I've seen students who can't get to lunch break at DHS in time enough to get their lunch and get to the next class because there's too many students in line. I've seen the teachers fundraising to get supplies in their classes. I've seen parents fundraising. We had donations made so that teachers can afford supplies. That's not meeting the need. And I still remain concerned with the New England Association of Schools and Colleges report that came out a few years ago. Many of those marks in that report are still not addressed. It's concerning to me, and I will agree with Councilman Fox at the budget ad hoc when he said we are going off a fiscal cliff pretty soon. We can build as many buildings as we want. We've got to staff them as well to meet the need. Over and over again during the budget ad hocs, I kept hearing the same thing from every department. We're short-staffed. The city is ballooning to 90,000 residents. And the finance director says he used to have 40-something staff members, and he's got 30 just about. More people need more services. Can't do way too much with all that less. And that has been the reality for the Board of Education for years now. I served on the Board of Ed. I saw it firsthand. We really need to come to a point where we realize that the best investment that our city can make is investing in our future, and our future are our children. They are the economic drivers of the future, and it's a good opportunity for our seniors as well. So it's disappointing to see and hear these different numbers and not know exactly where they're coming from, but one thing we cannot disagree on is that there is a need, and we're not meeting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. At this time, I'd like to call on St. Hilaire. Mr. St. Hilaire, our finance director, for a little explanation, please.
Sure. As you recall. All right, thank you. Karaoke night here, hold on a second. All right, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, as I started off saying, there's a $15.5 million difference in the budget, and that's why we break it out in the budget. There's 3 different lines. You have health and human, or the health line, which is 200 plus. You have the Head Start, which is another 200 plus, and then you have the amount directly to the Board of Ed. The one directly to the Board of Ed, there's between our adopted budget for this current year and their proposed is $15.5 million. We increased it by 4.1, the adopted budget from this year. That brings it down to the 11.4 million that was referenced by the Board of Ed CFO. So when you start deducting the 2.5 million in increase in alliance money, and then you deduct the surplus from fiscal year 21, now we're back down to that delta of about $6.2 million. Okay. Does
Thank
that
you,
make it
Mr.
clear?
St. Hilaire.
Okay.
Any more discussion? Councilman DeGiulio.
Thank you, Your Honor. So I just have 2 brief comments. One, I agree with many of my colleagues up here on the dais. Several people have said, hey, there's just numbers all over the place. It's really hard to understand it. Let's fundamentally, try to get our heads around this going forward so we understand what's going on. That's a process. So I don't disagree with any of those comments, and I appreciate them being made, and we have to figure that out. But, you know, I look at two specific things from the budget meetings and from where we are sitting here today with additional information that again, is a bit different than the budget meeting, okay? You know, we hear $15.5 million as a delta, as a request difference, funded at 4.1, creating a difference of 11.4 from the Board of Ed Finance Director. Well, you know, we received a proposed budget increase communication today from the administrators at the Board of Education stating their increase was $8.7 million, and we were giving them $4.1 million, creating a whole of 4.6. So I guess any of us can just pick the number that we want to use and try to back into the arithmetic on it. But just in an effort to try to shore up and draw a box around this, you know, there is a significant contribution from the city of Danbury to the Danbury public school system that we're all committed to, we've been committed to. We fund the Board of Education every single year more money than we gave them the prior year. Do they get the budget request every year? No, but they always get more than they got the previous year. Okay, those are facts. And when we look at $4.6 million being the difference, because I'm going to use that number because that's a number I was given today, and we look at $4.6 million divided into the total budget of what they're receiving, that's 3.25%. So that means they're 97% of the way there on a full budget, okay? So I think that's something to be proud of, and I think that's something the taxpayers should feel good about. Based on these numbers, they're getting 97% of what they need for the school year. Now, $4.6 million, that difference, compared to the city's budget, $277+ million, that's less than 1.7% of our total budget, 1.65 with rough arithmetic. So to think that the city council, the taxpayers of Danbury are not behind the Board of Education and the Danbury Public Schools and funding them and the students is just not an accurate statement. The city council has always been and remains dedicated in standing to serve our children and our taxpayers, our teachers, our faculty, and the educational needs of our community. And if anything ever came down to a couple $1 million in May or late May, whenever they wouldn't be able to finish the school year till June, I have the full faith of the mayor, his staff, and our finance department that those things would happen. The city plans accordingly. The city has money. The Board of Ed has money, and you know the numbers are not as big as they're being purported to be. And like I said, we're about 97% of the way there, 96 and change % of the way there. I think you know I'm proud of funding those numbers and seeing how we go from there, knowing that the delta is a few $1 million that the city of Danbury would always stand behind if the Board of Ed needed it. And again, I always appreciate everything the teachers do. I think the taxpayers should be confident in the fact that the city of Danbury, the city council supports education and our students in Danbury, including the faculty and staff with what they need. And thank you for indulging me these last few minutes.
Thank you, Councilman. Any further discussion? Councilman Levy.
Thank you, Your Honor. I didn't want to reopen the ad hoc committee, but some of the information that came out during that period, I think the public is entitled to know that this is their budget, okay? And the people that spoke, I doubt very much whether any of them knew that a budget existed like this for the Board of Education. And a number of issues came out during the ad hoc committee. I think Councilman Fox pointed out the inconsistencies that existed between what the committee was presented with and what the Board of Education presented. I pointed out one area because, and that is I went through 42 categories that were under budgeted by roughly $3.5 million. And I went through 7 to 75 categories that were budgeted for $13.5 million. Now, if you subtract the under budgeted from the over budgeted, you wind up with somewhere around $10 million. I guess that speaks to the fact, number one, we're on our fifth time trying, getting an extension to get an audit from the Board of Education. And number two, how good are these figures that are in this book? What can we rely on? I understand it was a difficult year. They went through the board, saw several finance directors, and there was also had the issue with COVID. But I think the public is entitled to know that they're not underfunded. In this case, I think if a teacher looks for a particular item and they tell them that there's no money in that line item, it's because it was over budgeted somewhere else. So the reality of it is that at the end of the year, they had a $2.5 million surplus. So apparently that money hasn't been managed very well. And we look to get every dollar we can towards education. I believe the number, correct me if I'm wrong, 65% of all tax dollars that are collected in the city of Danbury go to education. So the idea that we are in any way making it less than a top priority education is totally false. I've worked at different times with 4 different mayors and 3 different finance directors. And I've heard the same thing. They come every year, they come in here and tell me how bad we are as a city council because we're underfunding. Well, you know, I think our president just pointed out, Mr. DiGilio, about $4 million shortage. A $4 million shortage on a $141 million budget is relatively small. It's a lot to the taxpayers, and there are people out there that were really hurting and they can't afford another tax increase. But it's necessary for us to keep solvent as we are. And I think that my children have gone through the Danbury school system and gone on to higher education. It's an excellent system. It's up to the parents to take advantage of all of the resources that are available to them within the system, and they're certainly not being underfunded. And I think this is a very responsible budget, and I will support it.
Thank you, Councilman. Is there any other discussion on the education budget? Councilman Visconti.
Thank you, Mayor. I've heard a lot of great things being spoken here, Irving Fox and our president and Warren Levy and so on. I have
Councilman, could you please move the mic a little closer, please?
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have the pleasure of being the chairperson for our audit committee. And we meet 4 or 5, sometimes more times a year with our finance people, Mr. St. Hilaire and his staff. And we work very hard. And there are a lot of problems seem to be going on with the finance people in Board of Education. We are on our 4th or 5th time going to the state trying to get things done, and hopefully that will happen. But there are things that seem to show up, which I think Councilman Levy pointed out, where money seems to be going here, there, and everywhere, and that seems that over a period of time, it's really been a real mess. So we are working hard with these people, and we know that sooner or later things will get taken care of. But I also want to say, and I'll say it quickly, is that I just started my 19th year here, and I can honestly say that this council, no matter who it is alongside of myself, works very hard for everybody, not just the Board of Ed. We work hard for them, certainly, because we get the kids done the right way and get them going. But it's also everything else, especially in this day and age with the pandemic, with the possibilities of inflation and everything else coming out of Washington. But we work hard, and we try and work hard for everybody, not just the Board of Ed. There's people out there that can't afford to pay their mortgage. They can't afford to buy food or put on a table, so on and so forth, pay for the cars. It just keeps going and going and it gets worse. But that's why we're here, and we will stay here and we'll work as hard as we possibly can for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Is there any further discussion on the education budget? Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll try your minds. All those in favor? Roll call, please.
Crusade. Aye. Calla.
Aye.
Eriquez.
Aye.
Knapp.
Aye.
Levy.
I support it.
DiGilio.
Yes.
Fratello.
No.
Visconti.
Aye.
Esposito.
Yes.
Palace.
Yes.
Esposito the third.
Yes.
Fox.
Abstain.
Massey.
Yes.
Palma.
Yes.
Henry.
Yes.
Britton.
No.
Santos.
No.
Perkins.
No.
Chianese.
No.
Camisa. Yes. Molinaro.
No.
Thirteen yeses, 6 noes, 1 abstention.
Motion carries. Thank you.
14, 6 and 1. 14, 6 and 1.
Motion passed.
Sorry about that. 14 yeses,
1 abstention.
6 noes, 1 abstention.
Thank you.